Well, welcome to Year 8, chaps. Our first topic in Year 8 is the Renaissance. An absolutely beautiful period of history to study, actually. Some really interesting, some amazing, and some wonderful things for us to study. We're going to ask, to start off with, though, what was the Renaissance? And indeed, was there such a thing as the Renaissance? And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Renaissance actually is a French word and it means rebirth. And again, we'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a moment. It was first actually used in the 19th century to talk about an earlier period between the 14th and the 16th century. And what people talked about when they talked about the Renaissance is they said it was like a new period of time, a new period of light, different from the so-called Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, or the medieval time. After the fall of the Roman Empire, it was seen as a period of being uncivilized, as being dark, and then came the light of the Renaissance. Well, let's look at that idea in a bit more detail. First of all, we've got to be very careful when we give periods of time names, because people living in those times, they lived in their villages, they lived in their castles, wherever they lived. They didn't go around saying, hey, it really sucks living in the Middle Ages, since the fall of Rome. People, obviously this is very silly, but people didn't say these sorts of things. Yeah, wish the Renaissance would hurry up and happen. People certainly didn't call the times that they lived in by the labels that we've given them. And just in the same way, when the period of time that we've labelled the Renaissance comes along, people weren't going around saying, hey, I think the Renaissance just started. Love living in the Renaissance. How about you? Yeah, it's really cool. I love the new fashions. Obviously, people didn't call the time they lived in by the names we gave them. We've given that label after the time. And actually, if we look back at the period of time from the Dark Ages, the medieval period, was it actually really, is it fair to call it Dark Ages? Was the Middle Ages between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, was it really that bad? Was it really uncivilized? Well, actually, I don't think that would be fair, because during that time, in the 10th century, for example, the world's first universities started. Beautiful cathedrals like the one you can see here, made of Gothic architecture. This is Notre Dame in Paris, and if you look at this building, it's incredibly beautiful, detailed, complicated. This doesn't seem to be the work of uncivilized people. So perhaps not really fair to call the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, they're certainly not uncivilized. But we can recognize some changes that occur in the Renaissance, and let's look in a little bit of detail at some of those changes. We're going to look at a lot more detail over the next few weeks, but we'll just sort of summarize them in this lesson. So there were huge changes in art, for example, in architecture, the way buildings were designed and how they looked. In science and learning, there was a big shift, a big change in people's thinking. Printing was developed in Europe. It had been invented earlier in China, but a new type of printing was invented in Europe. And there was a big change in religion as well. So let's move on and look at some of those changes in a little bit of detail. Well, the picture you can see on the top left there, this is from an illuminated manuscript. It's from a copy of the Bible made by monks in the time we call the Middle Ages. I think it's actually very beautiful, but you can see it is very different from this later piece of art made during the Renaissance. And if you look, for example, at the medieval piece of art, it's quite flat, isn't it? Whereas you can see, if you look at the painting on the bottom right, this is something that was developed during the Renaissance, and that's perspective. People worked out how to make pictures and look like they had perspective. The laws of perspective were worked out. Something else, a little bit difficult, this word. This word is chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro means making your painting interesting by having real big contrast between very dark bits in your painting and very light bits in your painting, and sort of more shading as well to make things look a bit more three-dimensional instead of the quite flat images. Still quite beautiful images, I think, but instead of the flat images you see in the art of the so-called Middle Ages. I think we can see in a bit of detail here. Here's a figure from that same manuscript from the Middle Ages, And if we look at this painting now by Leonardo da Vinci, you can really see a big difference. Something that you probably notice as well is the painting by Leonardo's painting, it looks a bit more realistic. That's because Leonardo da Vinci and other Renaissance artists, they studied anatomy. They studied how the human body was put together. And you can also see this chiaroscuro, see the very dark background, and then the figure of the woman and her pet, they really stand out against that dark background. Again, contrast the hand. This hand looks very realistic, doesn't it, in Da Vinci's painting, whereas this one is more like an idea, a quick sketch of a hand. I'm sure you must recognise this very famous statue, and again we'll look at this in a bit more detail in another lesson down the road. This is the famous David by Michelangelo, and again, there's no way you could sculpt a statue like this without having studied anatomy, how the human body is put together. Architecture, another big change. Well, personally, I don't know if you agree, but I really like a lot of Gothic architecture. It's very beautiful, but there were big changes in architecture. And I'm going to show you a picture of a building in Florence in Italy. This is the cathedral in Florence in Italy. And what do you notice that's different? Well, actually, most of this church is actually quite Gothic, but you have something here, a huge dome. And really, during the Middle Ages, people had lost the technology to be able to build massive domes like this. The Romans had managed it before in buildings like the Pantheon, but this ability to make huge domes was lost until the Renaissance. Okay, so big change in architecture. Science and learning also changed. In the Renaissance, people started to look back at the classical period. The classical period is Greece and Rome. So they started to find old books, old manuscripts, old learning from the time of Greece and Rome. Big developments also in astronomy. Later on, we're going to look at a conflict between a man called Galileo, and he got kind of in trouble for his ideas about the solar system with the church. And we're going to look more, again, in more detail later. Anatomy, I've talked a little bit about already. Back in the Middle Ages, people were not allowed to look to cut open dead bodies. It was forbidden by the church. But over a period of time, it wasn't straight away, but gradually during the Renaissance and after, people started to get dead bodies, cut them open, and in order to see how the bodies were put together, how they worked, where things were in the body, to gain a better understanding of the human body. Something else was humanism. What's humanism? Well, just have a very, very quick look at humanism. Humanism, well, this guy here, with the sort of bunch of leaves around his head, very famous in Italy. This is a man called Petrarch. He was an Italian scholar. A scholar is basically someone who reads lots of books and is very learned and writes lots of books too. He was a scholar and a poet. He lived in the 14th century and he was a humanist. Basically, the humanists sort of said, and this is a very, very simple summary, the humanists said, look, it's okay to look back at the knowledge from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. It won't make God angry. In fact, God has given humans their vast intellectual and creative potential to be used to their fullest. So it's saying that, look, as humans, we can create wonderful things, we can create beautiful things, we can learn lots of things, for example, from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and that's not against God, that's not against the church. A huge development in the time of the Renaissance. This was printing. As I said before, printing had been earlier developed back in China. A lot of inventions had happened before, way before Europe, in China. But this was quite a new type of printing with movable metal type. And what it did mean was that you could print thousands of pages a day from one printing machine. And just like today with the internet, it was a massive information revolution. Ideas really spread more quickly. People learned about new ideas more quickly. Like I say, just like today with the internet really. Here's a picture from Gutenberg's workshop. You can see people printing out paper. Before that, it would take a monk, maybe he could produce 2 pages a day. So a huge change from 2 pages a day to thousands of pages a day from one machine. A big change also with religion. In Europe at the time, Western Europe, really before the Renaissance, there was one powerful Catholic church. Well, during the Renaissance, something happened called the Reformation. And again, we'll look at that in a bit more detail later on. But what it meant was that the church split. And so you have different types of Christianity today. So we can identify some big changes and some important events. If you remember, we looked at the big changes in art, in architecture, in science and learning, astronomy, this idea of humanism, changes in religion. Where did it all begin? Italy. In fact, you can most books when they write about the Renaissance, they point to a certain city in a certain time, and that city is Florence. We can really see an explosion of new ideas and changes starting in Florence in Italy. Italy back then, in the 14th century, was not one country. You can see there were different countries, the Kingdom of Naples, the Papal States, and so on. And it's this area here and this city, Florence, back in the 14th century, that we can really identify that as the place where the Renaissance started. And one family stood at the heart of the Renaissance. And we're going to look in more detail at this family as we go through our series of the Renaissance. And that family was the Medici. Okay, so I hope you've made some good notes from that, and good luck with the quiz.